So in the last panel, we talked a lot about some of the challenges with email in terms of privacy and information that we may or may not be comfortable with sharing. And it might seem that this next session, which is all about data, might seem like kind of the opposite direction. But the reality is that technology has the opportunity to make our lives easier, in theory. That's always been the promise, right? I'm glad that my phone has tracking so that if I get lost or injured, that someone can find me from a rescue squad, or my girlfriend can locate me if there's an emergency, or if my phone gets stolen. I'm also glad that my itineraries for my trips can be nicely formatted for me so that I don't have to do all that work myself and figure out time zone changes and things like that. There's a lot that's in our email that is really valuable. But also, there's a lot we have to be careful about. So that is one of the theses for today is where is that balance? And I'd like to welcome my panelists for this next session, if you guys could all find a seat up here, where we're going to talk about that balance with data and the promise that is now available to us. Things have changed in terms of access to big data, and by that I mean the fact that we can crunch numbers very quickly, that we can store large amounts of data very quickly. There's new forms of databases. And similarly, there's a lot more storage now, which means that we have information that before had to be destroyed or printed out or stored locally is now available. So there is a lot of promise within that. There's a lot of power within that. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So I've got three panelists here. I've got Raj Singh here, who's the founder and CEO of Tempo, which is a smart calendaring app, which I use, I love. And it gives you some nice information about the appointments that are coming up, the emails that are tied to it, things like that. And Tempo was spun out of, should I be saying Tempo AI? Tempo was spun out of SRI, the Stanford Research Institute. They had all kinds of great natural language processing patents and skills that they put into Tempo. And formerly, he was an EIR there at SRI. And formerly, Raj was also the founding VP of business development for Skyfire, a mobile browser that supports full flash rendering. We also have Edith Harbaugh from TripIt. She leads product strategy for TripIt and is one of the founders of TripIt for Teams, an easier way to organize travel plans for the whole team. And if you don't, how many of you use TripIt? Curiosity? How many of you used it for this trip? Yeah? It's pretty cool. It said on my calendar, Jared has a trip planned to Mountain View, which is hilarious because I live in the city, but I stayed overnight nearby. So everybody sees that. I love the data and the insight that TripIt has, especially when you're planning with other people who don't necessarily have all those receipts that came in over email to my account and not to theirs. It just puts it all there for the group, which is great. And from her work on portal sharing in the past, she also has 2 patents. We also have Phil Friedman, who leads product management at Volometrix, a startup based out of Seattle. They do really interesting stuff. They look at the entire corpus of your Exchange or Google Apps mail for the company and then figure out all kinds of business intelligence that can be actionable. The team came from the background of the consulting world at Bain Consulting, and they saw that their customers were trying to figure out how much time they spent with partners, with vendors, how effective people were within an organization. And in the past, that kind of stuff was done with surveys, or by looking at people and watching them. But the fact is the corpus of email data answers a lot of those questions. So they made that a lot easier for businesses. They have this really powerful product that's in the enterprise space called Volometrix that does that. And formerly, he served in product management roles at Microsoft, where he was the senior director of IT Pro Audience, and at several other organizations. And I'm sorry I keep talking. I just want to point out that we spend half of our day reading and responding to emails. And the fact is that there are so many patterns to that process. Maybe we don't want the government to know the answers to what those patterns are and to figure it all out. But the fact is that there's patterns in who we write to, patterns in the way we schedule appointments, patterns in the type of information we want to hold on to. And some of those are things that only a computer could identify. For example, things like whether we're spending too much time with a particular employee or customer. That's something that you're not going to know from the micro looking at each individual message. You need to have a tool that analyzes that. So technology has the ability to identify those patterns. And companies like these, they're making it easier to identify some of those patterns. So I'd kind of like to use that as a leading off. I'd love to understand what are the particular patterns that you all each focus on, and what kind of, to sort of just give a framework for folks to know that besides correspondence, what is really valuable with an email. So maybe starting with you, Raj.
Sure. Okay, maybe. We started with the goal of just trying to add more context to your calendar. So the premise was, can I help you prepare you for your next meeting? And we had some interesting semantic-related technologies from SRI that could do a whole range of things, of which we leverage a very small percentage of, and mostly because of combination of how much compute we want to do on that content and what sort of comfort level the end user has. So I'll give you some examples. So agenda extraction is something that we do pretty well, but we don't actually surface it right now as a type of content that you might want to take out of an email. Topic analysis, so trying to identify important, so you think about like, tags, let's say on Flickr or whatnot, trying to identify topics that might be interesting to you right now, maybe based on your discussion. We do quite a bit with relationship analysis, so who's important to you. I equate this to something we call the meeting graph. So if you sort of take your LinkedIn network, that's sort of your Uber address book, but now let's apply weights into that graph. So instead of getting a LinkedIn wall that has updates from everyone, it's weighted based on who's important to you right now. So it's like applying the Dunbar number, but to your business network. We look at family. So there's a lot of patterns you can infer for when you're communicating and corresponding with family. One of the things that's interesting from our perspective is people are pretty good about separating work and personal email, but they're terrible about separating calendar. And so we see that sort of interesting dynamic that goes on. But I think, and I'm sure it's going to be talked about today, there's ranges of things you can extract from email to benefit the end user. And I think it's important to focus just because it is so broad, and you are constantly dealing with this balance between recall and precision, or noise and precision, whatever you want to call it, because it is so broad. And so figuring out that use case and persona can make a big difference.
Sure. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So I guess just following that intro, we look at both collaboration data, and then we marry that with kind of structured org chart data. So we have a sense from our company, our customer companies, a sense of the groups in regions, in divisions that are working together. And so if you think about email and meetings representing how work is done collaboratively in an organization, we can then use that to map the life cycle of relationships within a company. So how does a platform engineering team work with the product engineering team? How does an engineering team work with product management or marketing over the life cycle of a product? And then looking externally, so between the customer and their customers, what is our relationship with each of our various customer companies through the sales process, through customer support, and then from an operations side with our supply chain partners. Are we investing twice as much time with a particular supplier that's one of our smaller suppliers? And so by benchmarking all these relationships and looking across large organizations, you can get a sense of kind of a blueprint for what is the norm and what are the outliers in terms of low collaboration, but also high collaboration, which could suggest kind of bureaucracy and process overhead. So we look at all those kind of relationship patterns across the organization.
So what's interesting is email is basically the repository of record for your life. I'm old enough that I remember when I used to fly to college, I actually got a paper ticket in the mail. And if you lost that paper ticket, you weren't going home for Christmas. Now everything is in email. So what TripIt does is basically strip out the interesting parts from those emails and format it into a beautiful itinerary. So then you always know where you're going. What's the most interesting part about this sometimes is just by stripping it out and presenting it visually, people realize they've made a mistake in their trip. Once I put into TripIt, I realized, hey, I booked this for November instead of October. These are real examples. Or I once was visiting Pasadena, and I booked a hotel for the night after. I actually needed it. This was pre-TripIt, so I showed up at the hotel. They were completely overbooked, and I was in trouble. So basically, how we help people see patterns is extracting the data they have and presenting it in a way that they can take action.
Sure. That's interesting. If you've sort of been following, these are each, what I love about this particular panel, which I guess I'm biased, is the that it's so discrete, the type of data each of you are looking at. One of you is looking across an entire company for patterns. One of you is looking specifically within email. And then Raj, you're looking at the connection points between email and another data source, i.e. the calendar, and then within that, how you can make that something more relevant to the calendar. So there's so many different ways to pull information out once you have that corpus, but they can be so different. Like to some extent, both Phil and Raj, you don't really need to look in the email at all. And as a matter of fact, I guess you don't for the most part. Besides when a customer specifically wants to surface something, you don't even have to. You can just look at headers. Whereas TripIt doesn't need to store anything. Whereas you guys do have to look at it at a certain point in terms of storage. So it's very interesting what can happen ephemerally, what can happen over time, how deep you need to go into the message versus how deep you don't. So there's no question that there's this insight in all different levels that people can benefit from. And it's interesting, in the last week, anybody here from LinkedIn yet in the audience? I saw Lee running around somewhere. Great. And there's going to be more folks from LinkedIn here later today to talk about LinkedIn Intro and do some Q&A about that. They actually didn't do anything different in terms of requesting access to email, but they got a lot of attention, and they're one of the first major companies that's requested access to email. And TripIt is another one of them. But it got a lot of attention, and I don't know why, when all of us are actually asking for the same level of access. We'll talk about that more later, but the fact is that major companies are now pulling this information in. So what is different about the environment today that you feel comfortable requesting that level of access, or that it's now accessible to you?
I think TripIt was not the first, but definitely one of the biggest users of OAuth for Gmail. Yep. And the reason why we did it is basically because customers asked for it. It was something that they very much wanted in terms of they were tired of forwarding their emails in. They wanted more of a set and forget it. And when the OAuth authentication came out from Google, it just seemed like a perfect opportunity to make sure that everything was secure, which is important, and allow people just the access they wanted to their own information. And we were also really happy when Outlook.com came to us pretty recently when they rolled out OAuth, and we were one of their launch partners. So thank you, Outlook.
Yeah, so we look at email and calendar as kind of the last great untapped data source in the enterprise. Almost all other application stacks have an analytics layer, and you look at where knowledge workers spend most of their time, 20 to 30 to 40 hours per week in meetings in large companies. I think we've heard some of the numbers, 300 to 500 email per day. And so you think about this reflecting how I spend my time in a large company and how I work with other people, and the inherent value in that has, until now not been used. And so I think it's that combined with the fact that most other parts of organizations are, in many cases, highly metric. You look at sales milestones and having access to financial data on a daily basis now, engineering milestones, people in outside sales offices being metriced on how many calls do I get through in an hour with how many customers. So all of the parts of the business are highly metric. And then you've got these knowledge worker-driven organizations that tend to be less metric. And so there's kind of an opportunity to do that and provide insight and transparency into the business using email.
I'm going to add to Phil's comment, and I agree with everything Jared said at the beginning. Cloud and cloud compute and getting cheap and storage and all of that related stuff obviously is helping drive why there's such a large interest in email today. But something you maybe don't think about, consumer email has been in the cloud for a decade. Maybe you were using Hotmail in the late 90s, AOL, even prior to that, Yahoo Mail, whatever. But it's not until the last couple of years that we're seeing some pretty percentage points moves of enterprise mail from on-premise or on-prem, as they say, to the cloud. And so for the first time, you can get access to enterprise mail without having to go through holes in the firewall or VPNs or whatever other sort of things that may be required, which I think is enabling a whole new set of applications, because the content within your enterprise email is very different to the content that might be within your consumer email. And so I think that is going to open up a whole range of use cases, and that's why there's, for example, business versions of Mailbox, and things like that. People thinking about how enterprise email is just much more actionable. A lot of different kind of content.
Yeah. So 2 points on that. One, we're going to have a panel later today with Jason Henderson from Microsoft and Bruno Morency from Context.io, talking about getting into, well, not getting into, but the changes that have happened in Exchange. And I think that will be interesting, both with Office 365 and in terms of just how Exchange Web Services is now much more prevalent. But also, it's important to note that, Raj, you're the one up here that is using Exchange Web Services over the air to access a lot of Exchange, whereas TripIt, as of now, is not using Exchange Web Services. And Phil, if I understand, are most of your customers that are on Exchange, you're doing that behind the firewall, is that right?
No, we're doing both.
So you have Exchange customers where you're doing it hosted as well. But you have that you have the option of going behind the firewall with companies, which a lot of us in this room don't.
I was going to, and this is a little side note, to the extent you think about iPhone demographic different to the Android demographic, iPhone users spend 10 times more on their iPhone or use 4 times more data. It's phenomenal the difference between an Exchange user and a Google Apps user, and then a regular Gmail user and a regular Yahoo Mail user and a Hotmail user. The Exchange Mail person gets 4 times more email than like any of those other segments, and it makes you wonder, like, okay, what's going on when you think about productivity from a broader standpoint. But it's interesting as you think about integrating with these different kinds of backends and what kind of persona is using that particular service.
Yeah, and a big part of the variable for that, if you didn't catch it, was that it's because the bigger the company you're in, the more email you're going to get. It's just because of mailing lists and CCs and BCCs and things like that. Well, CCs more than BCCs. So the bigger companies are on Exchange, and that's really the correlation there. If you work at Google, you use Google Apps, if you will, but you still get a lot of email, and it's because your company is big. And that happens. So it's very interesting how company size and type of mail will completely change how you consume that. And I think you made a comment earlier, Raj, about how much more expensive, literally, it is to support customers which have larger mailboxes. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So so there's sort of many layers of processing email. There's like looking at headers, as you pointed out earlier, maybe doing template matching if you're just looking for flight emails or purchase history like Slice or whatnot. But then if you want to get semantic and actually parse out signatures or extract agendas, then you're doing tagging across the email, exponential sort of cost that goes up, and you have to, in some ways, almost build your own set of rules around how you decide whether you even want to process an email. And so figuring out that balance is also important from a startup perspective because it's not cheap.
Yeah. So we talked about the opportunity that's available. What about the pushback? I'm assuming it's not all roses all the time. When somebody finds out that, when an IT manager finds out that, you're pulling in their mail, are they always happier? Or what is the story in terms of pushback to pulling in this email data? What are you guys feeling from your customers?
I think the nice thing about TripIt is we push the decision to the user. We have many people who are quite happy to opt in. If they don't want to opt in, they can continue to forward us emails individually. So it's never an explicit opt-in to use our service and forced.
I think we probably win the award for the most complex sales cycle, working with large organizations, the largest companies in the face of the earth across financial services and healthcare. There's usually a business customer, an IT customer that thinks about security of email, and then HR that thinks about privacy, but also culture. We've hired a lot of smart people and want to empower them. We want to make sure that when we look at doing email or calendar analytics, this is in that spirit. And so I think working through with all those stakeholders across the organization is now just how we do business. And then also allowing for users to opt in. So even when we work with large companies, we often do start with an opt-in, and we try to provide some value to every individual. So now you're going to get your personal weekly analytics that help you understand how you allocated time to your internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. And for that value, would you like to opt in to this program? So kind of checking all those boxes and make sure that all the stakeholders are on board.
I mean, the funny thing about best practices here is it's highly subjective. So one particular company, their vision of what best practices is with how you deal with email may be different to another. In our world, when we were building Tempo before launch, we took the most aggressive sort of stance, which was we were mining agendas, we were extracting topics. But when we actually came to launch, and part of that was we knew we were targeting prosumers, and we knew longer term we wanted to build something for teams and enterprise, we wanted to make sure we were CIO friendly. And so ironically, this morning I was at a CIO event, So because of that, we've pseudo-adopted what we think are our best practices. So we don't store any of the content. It's all proxied. We fetch things in real time. We store metadata. You can delete it. It's always user opt-in. So I think there's a range of things like that you can do. You encrypt the pipe. One of the challenges with encrypting the content in the cloud is it's expensive. You need encrypted drives. Something to think about maybe future. And then really creating the next layer, which is your story for enterprise, which is you could multi-tenant and not commingle the data with other users, or you could run it in private cloud and you could deploy private cloud on-premise, whatever it might be. So I think thinking through all of those sorts of options, and there really is good checklists you can look at to see where you kind of stand in this mix. And then that is going to self-select certain personas of users. You may not get a certain segment because it doesn't meet the sort of criteria, but in some ways you probably wouldn't have been able to get to that mail server anyways because they have it locked down with VPN or whatnot. So I think that's something you just have to think about and kind of figure out where are you in this spectrum.
So in light of a lot of things that have been happening in the last several months, 6 months or so, and partly in light of Lidar's announcement, are things getting better or worse in terms of people handing over this access? Has there been any change in terms of companies adding more security or users being more hesitant?
From my perspective, so we a lot of people don't know this. When we launched Tempo, we actually had done an out-of-market test before we launched into the US. And we launched it in Canada under a different name called Tempo. And we just wanted to kind of get some feedback, see how people were using it. And really, actually, what we wanted to get was metrics around how much stuff and what they're willing to connect, because it would help us better estimate what kind of ops load we would have. And what was fascinating was in the Canadian launch, it was coming out like 0.2, 0.3 emails connected per user. So a lot of people weren't connecting email because we sync the calendar from the device. Email is optional. And what's fascinating was when we launched, it's 2.4 right now per average Tempo user.
2.4
email accounts are connected.
So in other words, everybody's doing the
yeah.
0.2.
So the
8 times difference.
And we cap it at 4, which and people have asked, can you go to 5 or can you go to 6? We just don't want it to be abused. I would say I don't know if the velocity has changed. I haven't really graphed what the average has been over time, but certainly I think people are willing to connect if they see benefit from the experience.
Yeah. And I think over the last year, we've seen things progress more and more quickly, and part of that may be a statement on the market, people getting more and more comfortable with kind of sharing information. But for us, certainly, it was for something that's this big a deal for organizations, a big part of the velocity is our ability to tell a story and have a conversation with a large company. In some cases, the legal teams internally don't know. They don't know what precedent is set for handling this data and sharing employee data. And so over the last year, us being able to do a little bit of hand-holding and help them think about this and understand the risks has helped us work through that conversation more quickly.
I'll just add on to Raj's comment about 2.4 accounts, reminding me that at TripIt, it's not just that you have a work address and a personal address. Usually what we'll see is people have a work address and then many different personal addresses kind of from different ages of their life. You probably had one account when you first got out of college and then you progressed. So people definitely continue to use different email addresses for different purposes.
That's interesting. With the trend toward hosted email, both on the enterprise side, and of course it's been happening and pretty much already happened on the consumer side, that was one of the big factors, of course, to sort of standardize settings and make it easier for people, even just with regular old IMAP, because you knew the server credential, the server settings to get in. But now with OAuth, which theoretically is a security benefit, it also means now that it's one click to get into things. So, which is it? Is it that OAuth is making our users' lives more secure, or is it making it easier for us to get customers without people realizing quite what they're handing over? There's no right answer to this.
It's not just one click. I mean, if you look,
2 clicks.
If you look at the OAuth flow, Google flashes up some pretty serious disclaimers about what's about to happen.
And everybody reads those.
Yeah. I mean, when I sign up for something on Facebook, it wants to be able to pull in everything, and all I want to do is just not have a password on the darn site. It's amazing what people are willing to do. I don't know. I just find it very interesting. If, for example, Office 365 had OAuth, would that be more security? Or, I mean, it is security technically because you have the ability to revoke it and they don't have your password. But it also means it never expires, chances are. And it also means that it's just much easier for people to do it without feeling.
I think Google Apps, though, is adding more administrative tools around control with that OAuth for companies. And so that sort of one-click notion may become 5 clicks, where it's like a double opt-in, or there's like something sent to your phone or whatnot, which might be more akin to Office 365. So I don't know. What I like about OAuth is you can control it without, you don't have to expose your password, right? Your credentials, obviously that's important. And 2, you can control it from Gmail itself. You can go on and turn off access from different apps. So it gives you a centralized view.
Well, it's interesting. With Google Apps Marketplace, they have 2-legged OAuth, which means that with 1 click, you could, 4 clicks, you could set up the entire company to have access to all of their mail. So it's interesting. It's just something to think about that right now, we, to some extent, have us unprecedented access to things. And I don't know if that's going to change. Perhaps in light of the dark mail initiative, the alliance, then maybe that will start pushing things in the other direction. So it's just something that we all have to wonder whether this is the heyday for email data because of the easy access, or whether this is really just a stepping stone. I don't know. It's scary. But if one thing is clear, it's that you all are making it so that the old adage of email is where information goes to die, that's starting to end, which is wonderful. I'm curious, I mean, how many people in the audience, just out of curiosity, have ever spent more than 5 minutes searching for an email? Anybody? Like, it's unbelievable the opportunity that's here if this data gets more structured. I'm curious, are there fields that you think would be useful to add to email to make it more structured or easier to, to find things or to group things? Anything you'd suggest?
For us, selfishly, it's whether it's read, which is, I think, maybe a field that's available, just not exposed through IMAP APIs.
Not reliably, at least.
Yeah, and why is that important? There's a high correlation between when calendar items are created and the emails that are sent within that sort of day range. And so we use that as part of our algorithm to help figure out things that are relevant. So knowing what's read and what's not read self-selects what's important.
For us, I mean, I think we are able to include a lot of the data today, so it's using tags or hashtags or Outlook categories so that I can allocate my time to specific priorities or projects. And so as we see customers go from doing essentially no markup and just looking at how their time is allocated to stakeholders to now mapping that to work time versus collaborative time, project 1 versus project 2, they're getting more deliberate about kind of living their priorities and using that data that's coming through in the email.
In terms of sort of that point I made earlier, there was just the idea of like information, emails where information goes to die. One of the challenges, we're searching for email for our own stuff, but the reality is that oftentimes somebody will join our company after us, and the most important information about a specification was in an email that I sent to somebody else, and it's just not there anymore. So we all recognize that there's this problem where email is the lowest common denominator, so we all use it, and there's valuable information there, but others don't benefit from it. Are you seeing a trend toward where people are maybe considering email something that will serve as data that lives on? Much like Google Wave was trying to create this sort of aggregated data source that people could jump into and see what was going on, or the concept of a wiki in general. Are people, I mean, that's what Volometrix is doing, is saying, here's this data source for the company. And that's certainly what like Hummingbird and a lot of the knowledge management tools have all been trying to do, is bring that data that ties to the client and expose it to everybody that's working on that particular client matter. Are people starting to embrace that concept? Will that ever happen?
I'll take a stab. So our customers, the business problems are very much, most of the business problems are very much answered by the header level information. Mm-hmm. So that's where we stop today. But when you think about, from an IT perspective, us being able to quantify the 20 meg PowerPoint that gets sent to 3,000 people, then forwarded 10 times, being able to quantify the impact of that and say, this is a candidate for something that should be posted to a wiki or SharePoint or some other internal portal. And so we see them using some of this metadata to then make more informed decisions about how do we use the various tools in our tool chest, in our collaboration tool chest, more effectively. And if it's one-to-many sharing, then maybe this type of content can be delivered in another way versus in email?
Yeah, from my perspective, everything important resides in your email. A question we get asked, not a lot, but once in a while is, hey, Tempo, can you integrate with Box or Dropbox and pull in documents that are relevant to the events from those data sources? And what's funny is we've considered it and looked at it, but what we found is pretty much every attachment that makes the relevancy threshold to surface alongside an event in your calendar also exists in your email. And so we think of email as an uber data source, and I know people have been tapping it for years. And I think the key is just making sure you have a vertical use case to attack it with, because if you get too horizontal, it can also become a nightmare and how messy it can be.
Will somebody ever tackle that, though? I mean, is that possible? Is that the next big thing, is just turning all that email data, God bless you, across the company into I mean, the fact is we should be using Box or Dropbox or something, or Google Drive or SkyDrive to attach files. That would just make our mail servers faster and our lives easier and everything on mobile faster. I mean, there's so many advantages. Is that going to just ruin the experience for you, or is it going to happen?
So I think this is more of a philosophical question. I think there's a ops thing to what you described, which is independent, which is obviously where should the data reside and where does it pull from and how do you make an expedient experience. I think the philosophical question is a number of companies position their value prop as reducing email, and less email means more productivity. And that's the question. If you take collaboration tools like Yammer, even messaging tools like CoTap, Talk.co, whatnot, their sort of value prop is we reduce the volume of email in your organization, and by having less email, we've increased your productivity. But email is such a critical, fast decision-making way to sort of broadcast into a group that I'm not sure that it actually improves productivity. Nobody's really been able to measure that. And so I don't know. That's the philosophical question.
I was just going to say, in that, one of our use cases is that exactly. It's what does the pre and post look like as you start to roll out new collaboration platforms? Does that truth hold, and do you end up with kind of less bureaucratic and more fluid communication? The other thing that we get asked, though, is do we do sentiment analysis on email body? And so just as kind of a recurring theme, people have asked, I'm an executive of a large, tens of thousands of people in my company. It'd be great if you could tell me what's going on, what's the pulse of the company like that, because it's all kind of bad phone game for me going through executive to executive to executive, and I don't really have transparency to that. So one potential use case for kind of analyzing and aggregating that email body data.
So you both, or
I was going to talk about something consumer side.
You can do that.
Which is just on the consumer side, there's definitely acceleration of more email because so many receipts that used to be paper are transitioning to email, particularly with Square. It used to be when you got out of the taxi, they would give you a scribbled receipt. Now you scan your credit card and they email it. I think this will only continue, that what used to be paper will now be email.
Yeah, what's nice is if it's something like Square or Google Wallet, you not just have it in your email, but if you do want the nice organized Excel or CSV file of that, it's on their website too. So these are things that have been happening, some of which we can all sort of relate to, and some of which have surprised you. Raj, for example, your Canada versus the USA example. What other surprises have you experienced as you built a business around email data?
A lot of our surprises were ops-related surprises. You can't, I don't think you see this as much on Gmail, but you can't really underestimate the ranges of users when it comes to email and their volume and frequency. So from our perspective, we had, at launch, we saw users with 100,000 contacts in their address book, which is insane, or doing 2,500 emails a day, or even crazier than that, sending 250 megabyte attachments, because you really need to make sure if you're going to do anything that's doing any compute over email that you build in a lot of caps into your system to handle various sorts of load scenarios. The other thing, especially when you deal with Exchange, is it is a very, and Jared knows this really well, it's a very, I don't know what the right word is, particular beast. They don't all behave the same. It's very company-specific deployed. They have different latencies, they have different throughputs, they have different quotas, they have different folders, setups, and arrangements or whatnot. And so dealing with all of those permutations is like porting on old school Android. Just stuff that we found surprising when we were looking at email from an ops sort of perspective.
For us, I think it's, from a customer perspective, you think that after a couple of decades of use, most large organizations would converge on some norm of how they use email. And that's far from the truth. We see from customer to customer, the volumes per person at various levels in the organization by function all vary greatly. And then within a particular organization, pick 2 sales teams or 2 engineering teams, and we'll see one team sending 2x the number of emails, reading 2x the number of emails, and spending twice as much time in meetings. And so within that organization to now have visibility to that and be mindful of, well, what's the right answer and where should we be on the spectrum? That was eye-opening for us because we thought we'd have a quick set of universal benchmarks that are not so much universal as specific to the company and the industry and the culture and things like that.
A minor surprise, and this is kind of the genesis of TripIt for Teams, was how many people have travel booked for them by somebody else. We like to think we're in Silicon Valley and everybody books their own travel. No, a lot of people have an office manager, an admin, or assistant do it. So that's how TripIt for Teams work, is you could put an email address within the subject line and it'll insert that email into that person's account in TripIt. After they've given permission. So it's just a surprise that we could do another cute little hack on email and make life easier for travelers.
Okay. So one last question for you, and then folks that, if you have other questions, if you could line up over there. What is the future of all of this? Both either in terms of what you think is going to happen or what you'd like to see happen. We're all pulling stuff in with IMAP. We're doing it manually. A few folks maybe use companies like Context.io, which some starts to answer questions like, who are the most popular contacts. You don't have to analyze all their email history headers and figure it out yourself. But there's a lot of heavy lifting right now to get something very simple out of email. Is that going to change? Would you like it to change? What's the possibility of the next 10 years with data within email? You can think about it if you'd like.
I'm still thinking about it, but I don't. I get asked. I don't think email is going away. So that's my opinion with email. I see it as sort of true, tried and tested way of communicating. Going to the notion of quotas is going away. So you don't have to deal with employees within companies having 500 megabyte quotas and half their emails on their local drive and half is in the cloud. I think. What's nice is OAuth, and that standardization is making access to these different things more readily available, which is nice. I don't know the problem. The problem, as I'm thinking about this, the problem is the types of applications that you can build on top of email are so focused and vertical that I'm trying to think how you could build a layer on top of email that can maybe be some kind of context API that would plug into the mail server. Maybe it's additional sets of metadata. I'm not sure what it is. But it's a very different sort of thing to try to track purchase history out of email versus tracking your travel plans versus tracking agendas and did you follow up with the right people. And so that, I don't know. I don't know how to build a common layer, but without a doubt, I think the data is going to remain and continue to be valuable.
If you guys could put that in dark mail and keep it encrypted, that'd be pretty cool. Just an idea.
Less a technical answer. I mean, we think about now the cost of collaboration essentially going to zero. I used to have to be very deliberate about consuming people's time in an organization, go walk and talk to them and set up a meeting. Now I can consume the time from tens or hundreds of people in email or tens of people in a meeting invite like that. And so from our perspective, it's probably, email is such a powerful tool when used diligently and appropriately. And so we're focused on assigning kind of a cost of collaboration. You might be imposing a cost on your organization, and when your organization and people have lots of stuff to do, they're making trade-off decisions. And so, I would think of the future, people being more deliberate about when do I use email and how do I use it as a tool to engage the resources and the rest of the company, kind of very thoughtfully and deliberately.
It's to tie into what Phil said. Email seems more and more, as I said, the repository of record, and there's more and more communications going on in texts, in IRC, in Facebook, and I'd love to hear how you communicate with people, because I still wonder. Face to face.
In a tub, right?
I didn't get that part of the tour yet. So email is the permanent repository, but then there's more and more channels that aren't captured in an email, and I only expect that to continue.
Yeah, it's interesting. Once upon a time, not only was it the place of record, but it was kind of the only thing, short of maybe like instant messenger, but we have so many more channels now. Do we have some folks for some questions? I'd love to invite some people up. What's going on with email data? I'll comment on your point, Phil, while anybody that wants to make their way up to the microphone. I find it interesting, you brought up the point that people don't, a lot of it is how they use it and what their expectation is for email, and both in terms of in relation to other tools, but also like whether they expect that information to be consumed by other tools, or there's just so much training potentially, and I think that personally, I think that's where a lot of the future is with communications and with email, is people better understanding how to write emails so they can get responses, shorter things that are more direct, more action-oriented, and that's going to change email hopefully more than, I think at least, more than necessarily our tools do. We could be the structure.
How you guys doing?
Hi.
Really enjoyed the talk. I just wanted to ask what your view is on sort of the most interesting technologies you see coming out on unstructured data, and either converting that into structured data or graphing that somehow.
Well, email is semi-structured and unstructured. We have our own proprietary workflow where we can take an unstructured piece of content, tag it, is it nouns, pronouns, parts of speech, and analyze it, tag it, then tag. You run multiple rounds of tagging. Is it a place? Is it a name? Whatnot? And then we combine tags together, score it, and that's how we can figure out that if we look at an arbitrary sentence, that it's just basic natural language stuff. If this is a person's name, is this a place, is this a topic? But are you asking like in terms of like companies attacking that problem, or?
I'm more interested in the context of technologies. So we do a lot of unstructured to structured data at Engine, and it's mostly, we're using non-relational databases. Just interested in some of the technologies, either open source or otherwise, that are coming out that you're most interested in. We use a lot of Cassandra and Mongo and Elasticsearch and other things like that. Just interested in your view on sort of the technology space, how it's evolving.
At Volometrix, I'm assuming you're using some sort of graph database of some sort, right?
Mongo.
Yeah. Whether it's things like that or products like Titan, which are sort of horizontally scalable graph databases. There's, exactly. There's Neo4j. There's a lot of examples now of the ability to crunch 1 million relationships that you could never do 5 years ago without being actually Facebook, without having to patch together yourself. Now they put Cassandra in the world, and there's so many other pieces to this puzzle that this is part of why we're able to be all up on stage here, is because these technologies are affordable and accessible.
I'll take it offline. I think there's...
Sounds good.
There was decisions between Lucene versus X and this and that.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah, thanks. Hi.
So I have a question for the panel about email being the place of record and this idea of a horizontal use case. So for consumer email, we have an expectation of privacy, well-grounded or not, about our communication. For many companies, is the idea of the company owning the communication, and so a more limited expectation of privacy by the employees. For the Exchange server, as an example, Exchange server is, you can have many databases, but it's a database of all the communication with regard to email. So if we just take the Exchange server, have there been over the past 20 years cases of products to do useful horizontal searches across an Exchange server, not just in the aggregate of the metadata, but actually digging into using it as an institutional repository of the information of the company? And could you speak on any of these examples, specific or general case?
I'd say we haven't seen any. The only one, I don't know if it's horizontal, but like e-discovery.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah. So searching through email for legal purposes, but no broad analytics layer that sits on top of Exchange and then provides some general capability or a capability tuned to the functions or jobs of the people using it.
Can't remember these. I'd have to look it up on my laptop. But I remember pulling these up 2 years ago when I was doing our seed round. But there's a whole range of enterprise search companies. This is sort of pre-Google Search Appliance and pre-sort of new age, but basically deployed on-premise, index all the email, and allow some level of meta search. And I think they do some analytics. And I have seen some companies attack in the last decade analytics, trying to identify who's the most important person in the company, trying to identify who has particular knowledge of a space. So for example, the common example is you're in a sales organization and I sell to telecom and I now have to sell to aerospace. Is there somebody on the team who knows aerospace well that we don't know about, right? And so I've seen many instances like that. I just don't remember the names of these companies because they're like traditional enterprise companies.
Well, what's interesting about that, I mean, there are a lot of companies in the archiving space that do things with the corpus of data in a company. And what's fascinating is sort of to the opposite of like if it's the NSA that's sniffing our data, but actually a company that has a reason to have our data, like any MX record company that's blocking spam, any compliance company that's saving data for discovery, like we want them to have access to it. That's the whole point of their business. Everybody understands it, even if it's Sarbanes-Oxley is involved and stuff. So then you have companies that have that data that are starting to do things that are end-user specific. So one example of that is a company called Mimecast, which does a great job of a hosted-based archiving solution. And they're starting to do a lot of that relationship analysis that you were just describing. So I would look toward the companies that are the more traditional behind-the-scenes organizations and see what they're starting to do because they have a reason to get access to it that all of us have to fight for. But they're already there. And then now the databases are getting easier so they can, in other words, now there's the technology. They don't just have to store stuff, but they can analyze it.
These companies, just to be clear, are selling to the CIO, though. They're not customer-facing.
But they're starting to bring things to the end user, and we have time for one question left. They're starting to bring things to the end user now. Like Mimecast, for example, has a tool in Outlook. And all these companies already have something in Outlook so that people can search their mail so they don't have to all store it locally. Zobni. Yeah, Zobni is obviously they did on the analytics side for the individual case, yeah. Last question?
Sure.
Hey, Sam here from Engine. So in TripIt, you mentioned the person who's purchasing the tickets could be adding the email address for the trip information to be revealed to another TripIt user. So that's a hack you guys have developed on the sender's end?
No, I use hack a little lightly. We actually, you have to grant permission to somebody to your account. So
Right.
if I wanted you to, I would have to explicitly say you can email into my account.
Right.
And
So,
then we read it. So then you put it in the subject line when you forward it to plans at TripIt. And so we're stripping it from the subject line when it comes in.
Got it. So in other words, it's a hack to invite the sender to help you guys give structure to the big data. Right? They are basically putting a tag on the subject for you to have an easier time giving structure to it. So that's sort of a trajectory I'm seeing that's not being delved into deeply enough, where we are trying to sort emails and the big data upon receiving. And there's some things that we can do as the senders for the big data to be sorted and made more actionable, better classified. So I'm curious if you may have other experiences of this kind where the sender, and this is for the whole panel, the sender contributing to the structure to the data.
Again, I don't remember the names of these companies. I know there's a company you can email in if you want to schedule an appointment. So they're turning basically what you type into the body turns into a command or an action.
Like Ask Betty or Follow Up CC.
A few of those.
Or all
And
those kinds of
there's one for Salesforce too, from a CRM sort of thing. I've seen a company integrate hashtags into the email. So as you write email, you can hashtag different things, and it will attach them into the CRM. I can pull them up offline, some of these.
Sure.
But I think there's a lot.
And maybe in the future of where we proxy our email, sorry, maybe there'll be more opportunities for that, who knows. But any closing thoughts from you all?
Email is here to stay.
Yay, email, we all love it. Okay, well thank you so much to our...
I have one very quick closing thought.
Sure.
And Edith had mentioned this earlier yesterday, and I'm just going to read it. I guess it's hearsay. But I know this morning, I missed part of the morning conversation. I know there's a lot of concern around security. I'm sure there's going to be discussion later today around privacy. A lot of people take the negative angle on email, like what emails this, emails that. There's a lot of goodness that can come from email, and there's a lot of benefits that can come from email and how it can enhance and improve your workflows and experiences in different products. And so there is sort of this half full, half empty kind of philosophy when you think about it. And so I don't know where people are on stage and what they're building in this audience, but email is a great resource, and it can really, really improve your application and fully there to support it.
I hope you guys are buying into that, otherwise you're in the wrong place. All right, well, thank you so much to my panelists.